subscribing on Patreon on season 4 Revelation and Patreon.com/lumpin podcast.
Good. Welcome to Revolutionary Lumpen Radio. This episode is going to be hosted by myself, Shibby, and our comrade and co-host Ryan, aka the Zen Marxist. We're also going to be joined by a phenomenal person who defies the role of guest, in my opinion. They're an outstanding activist, visionary, parent and socialist who's been around the block and have since got a whole lot of love in their hearts and time of day for anybody who needs the support and advice. As amazing as our guest is, or the importance of the work they do for the masses, or even how they're raising a little one among all their instinctive activism and progress under capitalism, this guest still confronted by what we're all here for, to explore and condemn, with this deep dive into a 2-part episode that explores the contradictions and class traitors among Marxists today. So we'll pick up a few of the class traitor Marxist arguments against sex workers as we go. We'll hear their logic and apply actual grounded material sense, and not just the opinions of others, specifically proletarian feminist positions. We'll cover Sester Foster, the Nordic model, their approach to sex work, and we'll also hear of some better alternatives from sex workers themselves. The next episode from this will be with a proletarian feminist class traitor, so that we can fully explore the contradictions and logical fallacies that they present, that also happens to possess so many cringe Marxists who just got nothing but a detachment from reality. So here we go into it. Really, there's very few resources that it is resourceful within 2 hours, so thank you again to our guest Phoenix, absolutely phenomenal, love you, amazing person. I just want to say to everybody, just listen to how happy and bubbly Phoenix is, but how the topic's actually quite tough. There was some shit where she'd laugh at it, but I couldn't laugh at it because I was like, shit, that's fucking heavy. I was like, can't laugh at that, that's heavy, you know what I mean? But that just shows you, how conditioned and how vulnerable this guest is, how they've seen it all, done it all, and it's just part of every single day life. You workers can turn off when you go home and then watch fucking EastEnders or any of your shitty fucking TV shows. These sex workers on a full-time shit to struggle out here. Here's Sex Work and Marxism Fall with Phoenix.
The family on the upper side of town will catch hell without a ghetto around. In every city you find the same thing going down. Harlem is the capital of every ghetto town. Let me sing it. Across 110th Street, pimps trying to catch a woman that's weak. Across 110th Street, wishes won't let junkie go free.
Across 110th Street. How is this, people?
A woman trying to catch a chick on the street. Ooh, baby.
Across 110th Street.
You can
Find it all.
yes, you can.
Look around you, the lumping it everywhere. Just fucking get your head out from your fucking rocks. The lumping are there, the lumping are in the millions, and we need them for the love of God. Workers and the lumping unite. Lumpen-matic.
Sure. So I'm originally from Chicago. I live in Michigan now. And I actually started in the sex industry when I was in my late teens because I was a teen mother. That was really like the only way that I could find a way to work and pay all my bills because Like I hear from the accents, I hear the UK accents coming out, but I live in America and we don't have health insurance here. And I had a child who was born with like a lot of health problems. And so it just wasn't feasible for me to pay medical bills and pay for expenses, like rent and food and things like that with what I was able to make at that age at that time. And so I ended up doing sex work. I was in and out of the industry for several years. And now I'm actually one of the executive directors of SWAP USA, which is Sex Workers Outreach Project. It is a national 501c3 organization that is dedicating to helping sex workers and people who have been victims of sex trafficking. So that is what I do now.
Wow.
And so that's kind of who I am. I don't know. Like, if you have more questions, feel free to ask. I never know what I'm supposed to say when I introduce myself. I'm just like, I do stuff.
Yeah.
I'm the same when people do that. I'm just like, I don't know. I'm just a person. I don't know. What do I do?
A lot of people have got no other frame of reference because, it's just you do what you do in your material reality, and that's ultimately what we're talking about here, that other people don't get. There's not a whole lot of options, and if there is, you can only do the best ones, and even the best ones aren't necessarily great when you've got bourgeoisie ruling class fucking godlike men.
Exactly.
Flying across the earth doing whatever they want, whenever they want. Insane.
Exactly. For sure.
Yeah, no, solidarity, power to you as a parent trying to get healthcare. Honestly, it's just wow, what a world. So how did you get into like politics? Because you talk about politics, you have a podcast, everything basically is politics. Like, so do you subscribe to a specific tendency? And if so, why?
I think I'm probably most comfortable being labeled as a socialist. I think that personally, a lot of my ideals are actually further left. I think that already, it's very hard to convince people into socialism. So that, I guess, is the first step for me. I mostly got into politics just because of essentially my existence is a very politicized one, not just as time I spent as a single parent, not just the time I spent doing sex work. I'm using my very white voice right now so everybody can understand me, but I'm actually black.
No way. Let it come out. Just be yourself. I don't care. And look, honest to God, if any of my listeners have got a problem with it, come and see me.
I don't think they would be offended, but sometimes it can get confusing with vernacular and slang. And I just want to be really clear about what I'm saying so people understand me. And not maybe throw in vernacular words that people aren't familiar with. So that's really not because I think people will be offended. I just want to be really clear about what I'm trying to communicate. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point, but it's true, and it's important to do that when you can as well, without too much repression, because God, we want to get to know you.
Thank you. Yeah, and so, being black, I've dealt with, police violence. Essentially, I was born into poverty. My family has never essentially had money. I'm actually the first person in my family who's ever owned a home. So that's really exciting. We just closed on a house a couple weeks ago. I'm a homeowner now. I'm very excited about it.
Nice.
But yeah, I'm the first person in my family who's ever had, these sort of privileges and opportunities. And even from that, I came from a lot of pretty severe poverty. When I was born, my parents actually they were basically homeless. They were squatting in abandoned buildings. So I actually didn't have consistent things like running water and consistent heat until I was almost 7 because I got put into foster care. And so it was pretty severe poverty and, that sort of thing. And then how foster care went, being a black girl in foster care, I got put into families with a lot of white conservatives. The last family that I was placed with, actually, they're actually Trump supporters. So that should give you an idea of how some of my childhood went, having to live with these people, and then just as far as being queer, I'm a bisexual. I've dated women, I've dated men, I've dated non-binary folks, and, all these sort of things, which are in some ways just an identity, also impact how the world treats you. And so I got very interested in politics because I'm how come I don't have the same rights other people do? How come I get treated differently than other people do because of my class or because of my race or because of my gender, because of my sexuality or because I've done sex work? And so that really fostered the idea of really getting into politics and how it works, because I think a lot of folks don't understand that. I'm really happy that we're having this particular conversation about sex work, because I think that people don't understand necessarily politics or they don't necessarily understand how policy happens or how it's implemented. And so a lot of people who actually have really good intentions around sex work discussions often come in with really bad ideas because they don't understand the politics. And so like, I'm really excited to talk about that and hopefully clear some things up. So yeah, but I mean, I'm just a typical leftist in so many ways. Like, yeah, I like to go to protests. Yeah, I've been fucked up by cops. Yeah, I've spent a lot of time being poor. Yeah, I think that Jeff Bezos has too much money. In some ways very standard, but also because like I'm, watching my friends, my community, myself, and, how these sort of stigmas and these ideas are impacting our everyday lives. And it's just really brutal in so many ways.
For sure. I mean, again, like with all of our guests, right, there's a running theme, which is like, you didn't come to politics like arbitrarily, if that makes sense. Like it was because of your entire existence, right? Like your
exactly.
existence was definitionally political, right?
Exactly.
It's why I can't go on Twitter anymore, because I see people that politics to them is like window dressing. It's like an aesthetic. Like I can't do that. I can't deal with people like that. It's just an entirely different thing. Like I'm not here for that at all.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like a really like corny line to say, but that quote where it's like, you may not have an interest in politics, but politics has an interest in you. I find that to be very true. Like, unfortunately, like, you know what I mean? Like, none of us are just moving through the world by accident. A lot of us are moving through the world in ways that were, intentionally shifted to put us on a certain path through a certain maze. And I don't think a lot of people appreciate how widespread and interconnected like politics is as far as how it impacts your daily life.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I always say that there's no such thing as apolitical, right? It doesn't exist. Right? Everything from like what you get paid to the roads you travel on to whether you can go to a hospital or not, the education, like everything is definitionally political, right? People, I think too many people have this idea that there's like this zone that exists that's outside of politics, right? But it just doesn't exist.
100%, I agree.
So on that point, we've been doing a sex work and Marxism series, but this is going to be the first one going forward as sex trade and Marxism. Because like I heard an explanation on Rev Lev Radio and it made sense talking about sex trade more definitionally and accurately to me. But like, can I ask you to give our listeners and myself your thoughts on the sex work, sex trade phraseology? Does it matter to you? Should it matter to others? What's it about? Because it means that I'm probably going to have to change the whole title to my show because I've been doing it wrong the whole entire time.
No, I think language definitely matters. Even if we don't necessarily intend something to be a certain way, it can be interpreted that way. Like personally, that's one of the reasons that I say sex industry or sex work. I very rarely say sex trade unless I'm talking about like specifically in a legal context, only because there's a lot of stigma around something being a trade. At least in America, that's usually something that's vilified. So like the drug trade, right? Because our government did this whole war on drugs thing that really just meant like arresting poor people for having marijuana. It didn't really stop like addiction, anything like that. And so like, at least in America, a lot of times when trade is tacked onto something, it's meant to stigmatize it and put it in a negative light. Like, oh, we have to stop the drug trade because we can't have people smoking weed, right? Like, I don't know if y'all know, but weed is a Schedule I drug in America. So that means like it's legally classed the same as like heroin or cocaine, which is kind of, right, which is kind of wild. But, but that's, again, because that's the drug trade and it's meant to be stigmatizing. It's meant to create essentially propaganda and talking points that justify like a police state. It's meant to justify putting people in prison for petty crimes and those sort of things. And so I see a lot of that sort of same attitude when it comes to talking about like sex trade in the term sex trade. A lot of people who say sex trade are usually not actually in favor of sex workers having rights. They either want to force sex workers out of the sex industry, or they're okay with having like an extra surveillance state of sex workers because they're in the trade, they're doing something that's bad. And so I find with sex work, there's sort of like two different thoughts. One of them is a more conservative, right-leaning thought, which is sex workers are just immoral people because they're having sex. But I also find from like the leftists that there's a lot of attitude that like, oh, sex workers are poor victims stuck in this trade they can't get out of, they need rescue. And so there's this like rush to rescue sex workers without asking what help looks like to sex workers. And so it's just created like a lot of problems and bad policies. But it really does, in my opinion, have a lot to do with that terming like sex trade, because the trade is always seen as kind of like a negative thing here. So that's why I say that. Please, like, don't say prostitutes, don't say prostituted women. Those terms just drive me up the wall. But yeah, sex workers, sex work industry, it is a bit vilified. That's why personally I say sex work. Typically, if I do say sex trade, I'm really, and you know, this is something that I mentioned earlier about like, people don't necessarily understand how like your quote unquote real life is different from politics. If I'm talking about things in a political, like legal sense, I may say sex trade because that's like legal jargon. But if I'm like actually talking about sex workers or sex workers, I just say sex work. Yeah, it's very, and I again, like, I think a lot of folks do come into this with good intentions, but they don't understand how complicated the conversation is. So they just sort of latch onto the first thing that sounds good and don't necessarily realize the harm that causes. So yeah, don't say sex trade, say sex work industry.
You got it. This is now sex work and Marxism 4. Right?
I mean, yeah.
A lot of people, like, when it comes to any topic, they approach these things with, like, bourgeois morality without even realizing it, right? Because definitionally, we all live in bourgeois society, right? So each of us has, like, ideas on any subject or topic that are definitionally going to be wrong. But that's why, you know, Marx talked about Marxism being the ruthless criticism of all that exists, right? And that includes your own opinion on every single topic, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, because I think it really is important to keep that sort of context in mind, because something that I find a lot is that part of the reason that sex work is so stigmatized is because a lot of people can't imagine doing it. And so by default, they're like, well, I wouldn't do it. So if you're doing it, it must be for some, like, a bad reason. Like you're so desperate or you're a bad person or whatever it is. There's some sort of like negative thing.
I'd be too shy to do that. So you must be a slut.
It happens that mindset is very, and even among leftists, that mindset is really common.
Yeah, that's where they wanted to go.
Like, it's, I wouldn't do it, so something must be wrong with you because you did. Yeah, so it's like, all right, well.
Yeah, that's where we wanted to go, because, you know, I don't sit around here talking all day what liberals want. Who the fuck gives a damn? I care about what's going on with the Marxists today, and the bourgeois morality towards the sex workers, and they're trying to rebrand with this phraseology, like this sex tradeology. I see that as a legitimate tool, and I would not be surprised to see it just be a standard norm for large portions already to use sex trade if you're against, and sex work if you're for it. That would be insane to see. But obviously we're against that. We want to stop this now, and that's what people need to fucking...
Yes.
Well, thanks for listening, obviously, because you're here and paying attention. So keep up the good faith. I'll stop rambling for you, so don't lose your attention. So let's go on to...
No, I was definitely just going to say that I think that a lot of the miscommunication or the problem when talking about like sex work and Marxism is people talk a lot about theories and they don't talk a lot about material reality. And so there's always this like, well, sex work is bad, we should ban the industry. And it's like, well, the people who are doing it for money. So what happens to them, you know? And there's not necessarily a lot of that thought, because it is just a lot of theory, but the people who are living it are very rarely consulted in these conversations. And that's like really frustrating that, you have this theory about what's right or wrong. It's like, okay, but talk about the people living it. What is their perspective? What's helpful? What's harmful? What's going on? And I don't see a lot of that happening, unfortunately, in leftist spaces.
I mean, it's almost definitionally like idealism, right? They're like moralizing a situation and trying to sort of throw a blanket of morality over it. And,
Definitely.
Case. But then when you realize that that's not a material analysis, right? You need to look at the actual material conditions up, not like some kind of, moral idea that you have in your head and then apply it down to everyone, right?
Absolutely. And, it's so funny because I was actually talking to a bunch of sex workers before we started recording, just because I was like, this is what I'm going to say. Do y'all have anything to add? Because, I respect my community. And one of the great quotes actually that came from it was, until people who are opposed to the sex work industry can offer adequate alternatives, they do not have the right to push their bullshit onto the rest of us.
Yes.
And I think that's like a really big thing, because they're not offering alternatives. They're just saying, don't do this, it's bad. And it's like, well, I still have to eat. I still have to pay rent.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? Like,
no matter what we face, we must face the moment of truth, baby.
We'll actually cover that. No, we apply the pressure here. We, at Revolutionary Lumpen Radio, we aim to build knowledge on the revolutionary lumpen struggling today as Marxists, along with, everybody else out there, so that we can better understand this phenomena of a capitalist class structured society which we literally live in, so that we can better work with and give solidarity to this strata of lumpen class, the sex workers, as well as the prisoners, as well as the disabled, as well as other criminal elements, and anybody else who missed out. We're just trying to understand this and bring everybody's thoughts and knowledge and concerns here, but it seems like no matter what strata of that lumpen class you're in, you've got the same kind of ostracization from Marxists. So, I mean, this is just what I've seemed to learn, like, literally from speaking to people as well as experiencing in myself. That's something we're fucking trying to do here is bring these voices out, because it's real. It's like people read like documents on what people have researched on information, like scraps of information here and there. This is literally the truth, what people are telling you. This is how it is. We also want to prove on Revolutionary Lumpen Radio that we're not just sitting here talking about this and it's imaginary, like these, like we're just trying to make Marxists seem like the bad guys, but like, this is real. Like, I'd like to think I had a good idea of the situation already, with the sex work and Marxist struggle, but I know a lot of comrades out there are lacking an understanding as to like why the heck sex traders should be comrades and what the hell are these bad words have to contribute with their mysterious, distracting, slutty ways. I mean, it is mad. Why do you talk and defend sex traders as like a socialist? I've seen the script was set up on sex traders, but now I'm just like, I don't want to even say it. Fuck your sex trader. So why do you defend these beautiful socialist sex workers?
Well, I mean, partially because I am one, so this is my like immediate community, but also because I really do feel like sex workers are oftentimes very ignored when it comes to leftist movements in general. Like when it comes to like workers' rights movements, a lot of labor movements are not inclusive of sex workers. I think one of the big things is people don't understand how and why people get into sex work necessarily, because they're still stuck on this whole sort of like puritanical bullshit morality thing of, well, I wouldn't do it, so you shouldn't, instead of really looking at the material conditions that lead people going into sex work. So a lot of the reasons are because, things like homophobia and transphobia. A lot of people who start sex work at a young age are people who do not have family support systems because they came out and their families abandoned them, right? We have a disproportionate amount of non-white people who do sex work because of things like wage gaps. They are not able to make the same as white counterparts and therefore not able to survive, especially considering like the federal minimum wage in America is like fucking like $7, $8. Well, I don't even know what it is. It's like you cannot rent an apartment anywhere in America on living wage or on the federal minimum wage, and they haven't raised it in over a decade. You know what I mean? And so keep in mind that most people who make minimum wage are not white. And so now we're talking about, a disproportionate amount of people who wouldn't be able to make enough money in a legal job doing something like being a cashier or barista or working in an office. They wouldn't make enough to support themselves. And so that's a problem. A lot of sex workers get into the industry because they have disabilities, whether that be physical disabilities, whether that be mental health struggles, but they're not able to like stand up and work a shift for 10 hours a day. And so like what you find when you talk about sex workers is like a very diverse community of people who, if it wasn't for sex work, they wouldn't have another way to survive under capitalism. And so I feel like that's very rarely addressed. And so sex workers are seen as not real workers, and so they're not allowed into workers' rights movements. Sex work is seen as something dirty, so they're not allowed into racial justice movements or into LGBTQ movements, or sex workers are seen as not having real jobs like other people, so they're not allowed into conversations around wealth inequality. And it's like, but sex workers are literally a particular group that has found a way to survive under capitalism, essentially using a bunch of life hacks by finding other ways to get money outside of the typical sort of like 9 to 5 or work a shift, those things, because they physically, for whatever reason, can't do those things. And instead of being appreciated for finding alternatives or creating alternatives, as far as having community, as far as doing mutual aid, as far as finding ways to survive, they're really not appreciated for that. They're just really stigmatized. And it's really unfortunate because all these other movements could learn a lot from sex workers, the way sex workers organize and operate. And it's really sad that's not happening. But the big thing about that is people not understanding why sex workers get in. They think it's really easy to be like, oh, just get out and do something else. And it's like, that's not happening. If you can't physically work a shift on your feet every day, where do you work? You know what I mean? If you don't have qualifications to get a job, because keep in mind, sex workers in America and a lot of other places too are still getting arrested. It's harder to get a job with that arrest record, and so like there's a society that doesn't let sex workers leave the sex work industry. But then also nobody wants to listen to how sex workers got there or what they're doing. And so like, I feel like it's really important to bring those conversations to the forefront because we should be talking about ableism in the workplace. What happens when somebody can't stand up for 10 hours a day and that's what a job requires? How does that person work? How do they eat? How do they pay their rent? How do they, buy their medication? How do they maintain a life? And we're not really having those conversations or seeing sex work as an alternative to that sort of labor. And so it's like really frustrating for me to see people, saying like, oh, sex work isn't real work or sex workers don't have real skills when sex workers absolutely do. And they're finding ways to create communities and survive within capitalism in the most holistic ways possible. And it's just really not appreciated because people are still so stuck on, but you're having sex with people and it's gross. There's so much more going on.
Oh my god, you could be a comedian with that shit because that shit is comedic because it's so true. Actually, when you hear it out loud, saying it for what it is. Another point that I just wanted to raise as well is other people believe that you just simply want to turn everybody into a prostitute, everybody's mum, the sister, the brother, the wife. Is that the case, or is it just the fact that people aren't necessarily turning to sex work and it's not sex work that is keeping them alive? Ultimately, it comes down to money. You need money to survive under capitalism, and that happens to be the most basic way to earn it.
I mean, I don't want anybody to go into sex work that doesn't want to do it, and I understand that we all make sacrifices because capitalism and people may end up doing work they won't want to do. But for me, ideally, I know people are like, oh, post-revolution, this, that, and the other. Post-revolution, sex work will still exist. I don't care what anybody tells you, but I would like to see a world in which people do not have to do types of labor that they don't want to do. Whether that's because their bodies can't handle physical labor, whether it's because they have a mental health condition or, something of that nature that prevents them from doing it, whether it's because they, don't want to do whatever. I want people to have jobs that they find tolerable and acceptable. And there's people who do want to leave sex work and can't leave. And that bothers me too. I don't want to make someone be in the sex work industry if they don't want to be here. You know what I mean? But sure. But I would also say that about any industry because it stresses you out and it wears you down and it, will have physical consequences. It will affect your mental health. It affects sleep and depression, anxiety, and, all those sorts of things. I don't want people being stuck in industries that they don't want to be in. I don't know anybody who wants And what's actually fascinating about that argument that like, oh, you just want everybody to be a sex worker. If you ask most sex workers, hey, how can I be a sex worker? They won't respond to you because they don't want to tell you those sort of things. Right?
Wow.
Because
it's a secret society.
Oh, it's deep.
In a lot of ways, it kind of is. And so it's always funny when I see all these straw men like, oh, you just want everyone to be a hoe. And it's like, no, we really don't. Or like, oh, you don't care about trafficking. Trust me, nobody cares more about trafficking than sex workers. Like nobody cares more about trafficking.
Wow.
And those sort of things. But nobody talks to sex workers. And so people don't know what's going on because it is a very insulated community because there's so much stigma around it. And if you're outed, you know, you can face jail time. If you have kids, you can have your kids taken away from you. You can get, you know, arrested, have a permanent record. And then, you know, depending where you are in America, which I know America's huge and there's 50 states and it's super confusing because every state has their own sex work legislation, which does not help make the situation easier to discuss. But like in Alaska, any prostitution charge comes with a human trafficking charge. But ultimately what that means is like, so if you're a sex worker and you're offering services, and like, let's say you offer services to an undercover cop and you get arrested, you are also hit with a trafficking charge for trafficking yourself. So now you have a felony, which is a mandatory 1 year in prison for trafficking yourself because you put up your own ad. Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, what are we doing? You know, that sort of thing. And so like people don't, or like, you know, for a while in Louisiana, you would get put on the sex offenders list if you'd gotten arrested too many times for prostitution charges. But the sex offenders list, as most Americans understand it, is a list for people who were convicted of things like rape or like pedophilia or, you know, like possessing child porn. And it's like, why would you put someone who's a sex worker on the same list as you would put somebody who gets child porn off the dark web? Like, these are not the same thing at all.
These policymakers are fucking parasites and vermin that need to be annihilated.
Honestly.
I think I saw something that, like, the criteria to actually get on the sex offenders list is ridiculous. Like, if you urinate in public, you can be put on the sex offenders register, which means your name is next to, like, serial rapists of children. It's like, what is this? Like,
yeah, I actually made a Twitter thread about that, like, a couple of weeks ago, and I was pointing out, like, because that's the thing, they're like, oh, because a lot of the people who oppose sex work think that the sex offenders list is good, and I was like, it's actually really bad. And that's like, as a thing, people get really concerned when you say like something is bad, because like, oh, you're defending people who rape children, and I'm like, no, I'm not defending people who rape children. I'm saying, and I used an example like from my own life. I lived in an apartment complex. I had two neighbors who were on the sex offenders list. One of them raped a 12-year-old girl when he was in his 30s. Oh, the other one had been homeless and the other one had been homeless, and he got caught urinating outside repetitively because he was homeless and didn't have a fucking bathroom. And he got put on the sex offenders list too for like exposing his genitals within 500 feet of a school because he was peeing in a park at 2 a.m. Obviously, like, someone who's urinating outside at 2 a.m. and someone who's raping 12-year-olds are not the same person, but they're on the same list. And that's like a real problem. And that is a huge discussion around criminal justice in the United States, as that so many people think, oh, you're convicted of a thing, or, oh, you're on a list, you're a bad person. And it's like, no, these lists are actually bad and intended to create propaganda that keeps the prison system going. Like, right. There's no reason for that sort of thing. And the same thing with sex workers. Why would somebody who is doing sex work be on the same list with somebody who's raping kids? Make it make sense. Make it make sense.
I know.
That's why it's always confused me about, like, carceral groups on the supposed left when it comes to, like, you know, sex work, because it's like, why would you willingly feed people that are supposed to be comrades of yours to the prison industrial complex? Like, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I know I'm going to get, like, all the pushback from this, but I'm just going to fucking say it.
I got to talk. I got to tell what I feel. I got to talk about my life as I see it. Biggie.
A big thing is that their goal is to end demand, and end demand is basically code word for end the entire sex work industry. And so when your goal is ending the sex work industry, a lot of people get really comfortable with collateral damage. So if that means, putting people in jail, if that means police, because they're so convinced, like one of the big myths is that
Pigs.
almost...
They're pigs.
Yeah. Oh, fuck yeah. But like one of the biggest myths around sex work is that almost everybody who does sex work is like being trafficked or is being controlled by a pimp. And that's absolutely not the case. But so many people believe that they're like, oh, it's so bad. Like that, what the fuck was that fucking movie with that racist man? Taken?
Oh, right. Yeah.
With Liam Neeson?
Yeah.
Yeah, where he's just like his daughter gets kidnapped by traffickers, which barely happens. That's usually not how trafficking works anyways. But, and so like in the movie, right, like he goes into some building and there's just like, I don't know, like 50 like white teenagers in there, like drugged up and tied to beds. And there's just like men in there raping them. And people really think when they hear like trafficking, like that's just what it is. And it's like, that's not what it is. That's not how it works. And so, but they're like, it's so bad. We have to end it right now, no matter what. And it's like adding more police isn't actually going to end it. Adding these really shitty laws isn't going to end it. And, but people really do get into this sort of like panicked, like someone's hurting children or someone's raping someone, that they like somehow lose the ability to have like a nuanced conversation to understand that the knee-jerk policies that come from that mentality are actually more harmful than helpful, both for sex workers and people who've been trafficked. Like a lot of people don't know, in America, it's legal for cops to arrest people who have been trafficked. And that's actually something that they do. If they think you're being trafficked, they will arrest you and literally leave you in a jail cell until you confirm that you will testify against the person who trafficked you. But like arrest is violent. Being in jail is fucking violent. Like you can't take somebody, whether you assume or whether they were legitimately trafficked, out of this abusive situation, put handcuffs on them, put them in the back of a car, and threaten to give them a prison record that they'll have for the rest of their lives until they testify. That's fucking traumatizing. That's not helping. And people don't understand that that's like the result of these type of policies and these type of mindsets. Like people don't know that cops are actually arguing for the right to rape sex workers right now. In so many states, police are actually angry that they've been curtailed, because what happens a lot is, police pretend to be a client, get services under false pretenses, and then arrest you after they've had sex with you under false pretenses. People don't know that that's happening. So it's like, people like, oh, someone's being hurt and have this reaction to stop the problem, which is great and amazing. And I appreciate the empathy, but you have to make sure that your empathy is going in a direction that's actually productive to the people that you're trying to help. And there's not that second step that I see when it comes to sex work.
Well, thank you so much for bringing all of that out and really tragically bringing it out, because it is traumatizing, the damage that the law does to the people, and the people, as we said, start to act like pigs for the pigs.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it gets even worse, right, when you realize that, like you said earlier, because of the majority of people in the industry are, people of color generally, and we know how the police treats them especially, right? Mm-hmm. So now when you add that whole factor in on top, I don't know how people tell themselves that they're the good people in this situation, right? When they're literally feeding people to the prison state, right?
Yeah, well, I think it's especially fascinating from my own personal perspective, because there were points when I was dealing with homelessness, and so I was doing street-based sex work, and I was like routinely getting robbed by cops. Like all the time. Wow. It would just fucking, I got sexually assaulted by cops. I got robbed by cops. I got harassed by cops. And that was sort of a consequence of doing street work at the time. And, and then, I went on to do other forms of sex work. And now I'm, the executive director of like an actual organization that helps sex workers. But what's fascinating is when I talk about these things, oftentimes people on social media block me because they think I'm not a real person. They think I'm a troll. Because what I'm saying is so far so different from the narrative that they're fed about what sex workers are, that people really think that when they're like, oh no, this is a pimp with a fake account. And it's like, this is I'm not a pimp. like you can see my face on the internet in multiple places. I'm a real person, But there is that sort of thing that like, oh, it's outside of my range of experience. So therefore, anyone who's contradicting me is like lying or faking. And it's, really interesting if you do follow sex workers on social media, pretty much anytime they comment, someone will come in and say, oh, no, you're lying, or, oh, you're too traumatized to know what's best for you, or you're only saying this because you have an addiction, or you're only saying this because you have too much unresolved trauma, and really just not believing sex workers. And it's fascinating because I haven't seen any other group on the left that's treated with that level of disdain. Like I certainly see things like, like anti-Semitism or, racism or classism or ableism, but I very rarely see a left, like an actual leftist telling another leftist, you don't get to talk about your own life because you're too traumatized to understand what consent is. I've never seen some wild ass shit like that anywhere else. Like people will routinely tell me that, that sex work is paid rape. And I was like, I know what my consent looks like. And they're like, no, you don't. You're too traumatized to know if you consented. So now I'm supposed to trust somebody that I've never met to tell me whether or not I consented to having sex. Absolutely wild. It's the wildest shit you will ever see in your life, honestly.
Yeah.
Lived in a bubble all their lives, and now they're just telling you things that they couldn't even comprehend.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, they don't like it. And it's just so interesting that a lot of times these folks will spend time to argue with white sex workers and say that white sex workers are so privileged because they're only like online, like webcam girls, right? Like all sex workers only had OnlyFans online work, and which isn't, but I get the point about privilege. But it's like when I talk about my experiences, like, no, I'm actually very much the opposite. I have experienced, brutality and abuse and violence while doing sex work. So since they don't want to hear it because I keep, and this is why your models and your theories are bad. Oh no, did I just lose everybody? Oh, okay, you're still there.
Yeah, you roboted a little bit, but I think you're okay now.
So, that's just one of those things. And it happens, pretty consistently. But that really does speak to that sort of idea that I mentioned earlier of like, well, I wouldn't do it, so something's wrong with you if you did. That sort of arrogance and saviorism carries over to say that, well, I know better than you. I know your body better than you. I know your consent better than you. I know your state of mind better than you. I know what you need better than you do. And it's really infantilizing and it's really fucking offensive.
Yeah.
It's also a strange position to find yourself in, because if you really believe that, like, you can know the intentions and wills of other people more than they do, then why can't I say I know it more than they do? I don't understand. Like, it becomes a sort of a snake eating its own tail, right? Like, if I don't get it.
Yeah.
Can I just say as well, honestly, the privilege, when you were talking about privilege, then like the privilege is being able to speak to you now, Phoenix. Genuinely, honestly, love you. Thanks so much for speaking to us on this topic.
Of course.
I do sincerely value and appreciate everything that's gone into this. And you were talking about trauma earlier. Yeah, unfortunately, it does seem to be those who have the most trauma are the ones who are trying to be heard the most, because, we're not so easily recognised. So just some lumpen solidarity for you as well. One of the questions also pretty much covered it, but it seems to me that there's two camps. One that thinks sex traders are doing what they can to get by or not live a subsistence existence. And there's also the camp that thinks sex trading should be abolished yesterday, regardless of who needs the money they earn from that, what it's for, healthcare, housing, food, etc. So is this an accurate take, or am I missing some points out to make shit up? Is there really two sides that we're talking about that are fueling this, or is there a number thing, or is everybody just on the same page?
I feel like those are probably the two most accurate takes, is either leave sex workers alone or abolish sex work. But the problem with the abolish sex work is that's not rooted in reality. You really cannot abolish sex work. You can make it safer. You can engage in harm reduction, but you won't successfully in the industry.
So on the leave sex workers alone point, would you say that what that's getting at is the sex workers saying, actually, we don't want people who aren't sex workers telling us what we should and shouldn't have because we're capable individuals?
Yeah, I think that's definitely valid. And part of that too is also people who do not have to live with the consequences of their politics in this area. right?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Because like a lot of folks supported things like Sesta Fosta. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that.
Yeah.
But
and like the back pages and everything, right?
Yeah, right. So like shutting down places where people could advertise, right? Also, and like, because I think that it's so hard to explain. But no, I think that is really like one of the big problems when it comes to talking about sex work is people don't understand how policies are implemented and what the real life consequences of those are, because they're still so stuck on that, like, someone's being trafficked, someone's being hurt, we need to rush in and help them, but don't consider if the help they're giving is the best type of help they could give. You know what I mean? And so like I find that to be a big thing with the stuff like Sesta Fosta and shutting down Backpage. And it's like, well, those people still need to pay their rent and buy groceries. So if they can't advertise on Backpage, they're just going to do street-based work. But because they've never had to do street-based work before, they don't know how to take, it's more dangerous, obviously, than advertising online. But now they don't know how to take those precautions. And so now people, sex workers, are getting into situations where they're in even more danger. Like shortly after Sesta Fosta passed, so many sex workers had been murdered shortly after because they didn't have places to advertise and because they did not know how to be safe doing street work because they'd never done it before. And so that was a really big problem with Sesta Fosta. So, right. And like that sort of thing. And so that's like where the, like, please leave us alone and stop making policy about it until you understand what that means and how that is enacted.
Wow. No, I was just going to say, like, and it's also something that you could have been able to see throughout history, right? Like, it's always gone that way. I mean, if you think about like prohibition, the making illegal of alcohol did not disappear alcohol, right? That's not how that works. All it does is it pushes it underground.
Yep, exactly.
And then you get things like bathhouse gin, and you make people like Al Capone super rich while killing them essentially, right? Bathhouse gin was super dangerous. People died from it because again, there wasn't that safety and everything that could have come from regulating it, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think that's, you know, an incredibly valid thing, and that has happened, and that is what is continuing to happen with bad sex work legislation. And, you know, people respond and say things like, well, but there were minors being trafficked on Backpage, right? But like that sentence is the entire conversation to them. And again, that's what I'm talking about. Like, you have to be willing to have the nuance and have these discussions. So the actual reality is, yes, there were children who were being trafficked on, like, you know, minors who were being trafficked on Backpage. What's not included in that statement is that Backpage had an ongoing relationship with the federal government to report when those suspicious ads came up and give the details to feds so feds could investigate. Right? Nobody talks about that part. And so then Backpage went down. You know, these minors are still being trafficked. Where does law enforcement go to look for them? They don't know anymore. They've lost the digital footprint because all the websites went down. You know, so like that is like what we're talking about with consequences. And if you even look at, you know, a bunch of police, there were so many articles that came out within a year of Sesta Fosta happening that said street arrests were on the rise, that trafficking was on the rise, all those things. But these are all things sex workers said was going to happen, and nobody listened because nobody thinks sex workers are capable of understanding narratives or how to improve their own lives. And so it was really unfortunate that that sort of thing went through. And now people are like, well, we've learned nothing from Sesta Fosta. We've learned nothing from shutting down Backpage, despite the fact that people died, despite the fact that, you know, trafficking went up, despite the fact that law enforcement lost digital footprints of people who have allegedly been trafficked, you know, and they want to keep pushing and pushing these bad policies. And it's just really, really, you know, regrettable that so many folks are comfortable with this because they're still on that like knee-jerk reaction of, but someone's being trafficked, do something, and not considering if there's something is the best something that they, you know, could or should be doing. And it's just really awful. And that's the same thing with the Nordic model. I mean, I don't know. I'm kind of like throwing in a question. Can we talk about the models? I don't know if people know them.
Sure.
Yeah, so can we talk about the Nordic model? Because it seems to be a go-to example on this hot topic. Why is that?
So, because people are full of shit, basically.
No shit.
So when we talk about models in sex work, typically there are three major models. So we have the criminalization model, where basically everything around sex work is criminalized. That's what we currently have in the US. So that means stuff like not only is like trafficking or like pimping criminalized, but also being a sex worker is criminalized. Purchasing services from a sex worker is criminalized. Everything around it is criminalized, you know. And then we have straight up decrim. This is like what they have in New Zealand. Pretty much everything around sex work is decriminalized, except for things like trafficking. There's this idea that if you somehow decriminalize sex work, that like trafficking or pimping will be decriminalized. That's totally not the case. That's a lie. Please don't believe that. But so like New Zealand has decriminalization. The other model is the Nordic model, which is actually used to be called the Swedish model because it originated in Sweden. Then it went to the Nordic model because it was primarily done in Nordic countries at the point. So like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, right? And now it's spread. It's in Ireland. It's in other parts of the UK. It's in parts of Canada, those sort of things. And so that is actually a partial decriminalization model. And what people are trying to do is convince folks that a full decriminalization, which is what sex workers typically want, is the same thing as the Nordic model, which is only a partial decriminalization model. But the thing about partial decrim means it's also partially still criminalized. So it's really not ideal.
Why? What crucial parts of it are criminalized that should be decriminalized to make it more effective?
So under the Nordic model, what is decriminalized is like selling services or offering services. So if you put up an ad somewhere or you see someone and say, hey, I'll provide this service for this amount of money, that's not illegal. But purchasing services is still illegal. And then everything else that's around sex work is still illegal. And so I think a lot of folks don't realize the around sex work part as a problem or what that necessarily means. So in practice, what that means is because buying services is still illegal. So clients can be arrested. So that means that police are still following clients to sex workers, and sex workers are still called to court to testify against clients, even though the sex workers themselves have done nothing wrong, because their clients are committing a crime. So you basically you have to out sex workers, first of all, which is a problem. And you're leaving sex workers under police surveillance because they're still associated with crimes, even though they can't be arrested. That's a problem. The other problem is the crimes around sex work. So a lot of things that were allegedly intended to prevent things like trafficking and things like that are used against sex workers. So like a really common one in Ireland right now is brothel keeping laws, which basically says that anytime you have 2 or more sex workers working in a house, that it's officially a brothel. So even though they have the Nordic model and sex workers can't be arrested for advertising, they can be arrested for brothel keeping. So what you're seeing now is a lot of situations in Ireland where you have like 2 or 3 women living together doing sex work, and then they all get arrested for brothel keeping because they happen to be roommates, even though it's much safer to have people working around you, right? Obviously. But also like what we were told is that the Nordic model wouldn't harm sex workers. But if you're getting arrested for brothel keeping because you happen to have a roommate and you both do sex work, that sounds like criminalization to me. Why the fuck is someone going to jail if they're not being criminalized, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like entrapment because you're putting out the eye candy in the advertisements, but then you're criminalizing them for buying it. Exactly. That's mad.
Yeah, right. And like criminalizing clients, like obviously that's not going to help sex workers. And sex workers have said this. Sex workers who live under the Nordic model, they've said that like, I don't have time to negotiate prices. I don't have as many clients. So now I'm engaging in sex acts that I do not want to engage in with clients that I do not want to see because I don't have other choices. So, that's also super important to talk about when it comes to like violence against sex workers or sex workers feeling coerced to provide services they don't want to. That's a huge fucking factor about the Nordic model. And the other thing about like crimes around sex work, this is something that happens in Sweden and Norway, is that sex workers actually get evicted. Because keep in mind, the idea behind the Nordic model is to end demand, right? So to abolish the sex work industry, because they believe that essentially it harms women and children for sex work to exist. And so their thing is like, oh, we're going to help sex workers by not arresting them, but we're going to push this model. But because in America, it's called living off the proceeds of prostitution, that's like the technical legal term. So things like if I'm a landlord, right, I'm renting an apartment to somebody who does sex work. If the police find out that my tenant does sex work, I have to legally evict them, because if I don't, I can go to jail because I am living off the proceeds of their prostitution.
You fucking know.
And so, like, I'm not a pimp. I'm not a trafficker. I'm not making them do sex work. That's just what they already do, and that's how they pay their rent. But because of the way laws are written and implemented, that's still illegal because you're kind of wading into, like, pimping territory, which is also a conversation about how we need to, like, rewrite a bunch of pimping laws. But people hear pimp and have a like, oh, you're just beating some woman and taking all her money. And, like, that's the end of the conversation. It's like, it's so much more than that, because it shouldn't be that, you know, to rent to a sex worker makes you a pimp. Like, if you're pushing somebody into sex work and taking their money, you're doing that. If you're just renting an apartment to somebody who happens to do sex work, that's not pimping. Why?
It seems like to me, I can imagine there's like kind of a strategy to make people want to sneer at the thought of renting houses out to sex workers, just to keep this social stigmatization against them. That's obviously what the law is, you know, the criminal element. They want to just keep the image going as like social scum.
Definitely. And even in America, it's the same type of situations. Like, and this is also something I've talked about, mostly because the statute of limitations has passed. Technically, I could have been hit with like a pimping charge myself because I had an apartment and I would just let sex workers come and sleep on my couch if they didn't have anywhere to stay. But because those sex workers would do things like buy dinner or, you know, give me $20 to put toward the electric bill while they were staying there, I'm living off the proceeds of their prostitution. Like, technically, I did something illegal by letting homeless sex workers sleep on my couch, and that's really fucked up. Like, sure. You know what I mean? Definitely. And under the Nordic model, that shit is still illegal. So, like, it's nice to say, oh, well, we're not hurting women. We won't arrest sex workers, because they're obsessed with women. They don't think like anybody who's not like a cis woman does sex work. It's fucking weird. But that's like a whole other thing. Like, but their whole... But it's like, you know, they're doing this. They're like, oh, we're helping because we're not arresting sex workers. And it's like, but you are arresting their support systems, which leaves them alone. So now, if you know that you can't go to somebody to sleep on their couch, if you know you can't rent from them, if you know, like, other shit that's illegal is like driving, like if someone calls you and says, oh, I have a client, can you drive me to this location? That's illegal. Advertising online is legal, and especially since Sesta Fosta, a lot of sex workers used to pass around bad date lists to say, oh, I saw this client, he was really abusive, here's his name, here's his info. Passing those around is now illegal because that's promoting prostitution. So now you can't pass out a bad date list. You can't sleep on somebody's couch when you're homeless. If you're HIV positive, depending on what state you're in America, you still can't sleep in a building because you can get arrested for trying to pass HIV, which is all absolutely wild. Absolutely fucking wild. And like all these things, and it's like, y'all want to say that you're helping sex workers because you're not arresting them for selling services, but you're criminalizing, penalizing, and harming them in every other single way. Like, this model is fucking trash. And one of the things that terrifies me the most about the Nordic model in particular is, like, I don't know if y'all are familiar with the whole like racist incident at the bar in Sweden. Okay, so there's a bar in Sweden, and there were Asian sex workers who were working nearby. And then an Asian woman and her family tried to go into this bar. They're not sex workers. And the bar basically said, no, you're Asian, and so are the sex workers in this area, and so we don't know if you're a sex worker, so you can't come in here. And like, they did it based on race because you're Asian. Like, there's Asian sex workers, you're Asian, you can't come here. And a court actually upheld that. And like, I don't know how familiar you are with the history of racial segregation in America. But the fact that a business under the Nordic model can legally tell people who aren't white, you can't come to our business because you may be affiliated with sex work, is some scary fucking precedent. You know what I mean?
Separate but equal, right?
Exactly. And so it's like all these things. Yeah, and people keep saying like the Nordic model is good and it's helping, and it's like, it's not. Everywhere I'm looking, it's like you can't rent to sex workers. I still see sex workers getting arrested for adjacent crimes. I see sex workers' friends and family being, punished for these adjacent crimes. Like, you know, because keep in mind with this, like, living off the proceeds of prostitution, that's not just landlords, that's partners and friends. Like, you can't live with your partner and do sex work because you're paying bills together as a couple. That's living off the proceeds of prostitution, and they can go to jail. Like, so this whole, like, we're not arresting, it's absolute and utter bullshit, and it's just hurting sex workers in every way. I'm sorry, I'm so ranty. I'm sorry.
It's worth it because people need to fucking learn, including ourselves. So criminalised, extremely bad because it puts people into cages, takes them and locks them away for multiple years in the one and only life so that they don't even get to experience like daylight and wind and sun and just normal shit locked away. That is bad. Decriminalisation, we love that because, you know, it's closer to freedom.
Definitely.
It's not freedom, but there's less restraints in terms of the violent, oppressive nature of the law and the police coming down on you, which they would do in the Nordic model. But who's pushing the Nordic model precisely?
Most. This is some Handmaid's Tale level shit. The Nordic model is predominantly pushed by rescue organizations, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States and a lot of other places. So rescue organizations that want to get women out of sex work, and also by a lot of Marxists. I do believe you're going to have a firm on later. A firm is one of those people or one of those orgs that push the Nordic model. And a lot of leftists push it because they have sort of bought the idea that as long as police aren't arresting sex workers for prostitution charges, that it's a very benign policy, but it's not, because like all the stuff I just said, like you're still get evicted if someone is renting to you and you do sex work. You still can't have a partner live in your house and share, or a roommate and share bills with them because they're living off the proceeds of prostitution. You can still be dragged to court and outed as a sex worker because your clients are breaking the law, even though technically you're not. You know, so many sex workers get evicted. Like that's also a huge thing, right? And so, you know, a lot of people tune out as soon as they hear we're not arresting sex workers for sex work, but like literally everything around it is still criminalizing and stigmatizing sex workers. And I don't think a lot of people necessarily grasp that. And so a lot of Marxists actually support that position. And a lot of, you know, organizations like the firm do support that position. And that really terrifies me in a lot of ways.
It's also just a strange mentality, the idea that, like, you know, the bourgeois state will help you, right? Like that itself should send like warning flags. Like, wait a minute, you think the state's going to come in and fix this problem? Like, I don't think you understand.
Honestly, what really killed me was after the Rev Left radio incident was, I think her name was Bridget, I call her Bridget because I don't know how she pronounces it, was one of the people on that Rev Left episode. And then, like a couple days after the episode came out, made like a Twitter thread basically saying that like, we can't have prison abolition, but we need to end sex work now. And I was like, abolish sex work, but not prisons is a fucking take for a leftist. That is quite a fucking take.
Yeah. It's really strange.
Well, Marx is seriously pushing this one that I'm speaking to later. Is that really what they're pushing, this Nordic model? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's really awful. You know, and another thing that a lot of these folks will do too is look at like countries where it's legal, like Germany or the Netherlands, and like, oh, look at all the places where legalization failed. And it's like, yeah, we know legalization fails. That's why we're pushing for full decriminalization, right? You know. And so I think a lot of folks, when they hear that, they're like, oh, so, you know, trafficking is legal. No, it's not trafficking. It's specifically for sex workers and crimes that sex workers would be harassed for. And, you know, but again, I think a lot of it really, I keep saying it, I know, but I really think people don't know how deep, like, this bullshit goes. Because, like, a big thing in New York City for a long time was, wait, are you familiar with the too many condoms rule?
I don't think so. That sounds like a... What? What's this?
Yeah, so basically, because like one of the things about like the Nordic model is that it is like the next iteration of stop and frisk, which is... Wait, do y'all know about... I'm so sorry. I'm like taking up all this time like explaining fucking American criminal justice right now. Is this helping or hurting? I don't know.
Yes, no, it's really, really interesting and super crucial and important because we've actually got a larger listener audience in the United States, so naturally loving it. Keep going. Please tell us all about this.
So
condom search.
So this actually started with the broken windows model of policing. And if folks aren't familiar, it's like a criminal justice theory that if you stop small crimes, you can prevent major crimes from happening. And so the idea behind the model is that if you go into a neighborhood and you see petty crimes like broken windows or graffiti or like homeless people drinking in public, that is an indicator that there's going to be major crimes like homicide or arson in that neighborhood. And so the idea behind broken windows was that you can look at a neighborhood, determine it needs more policing, send all the fucking police there to over-surveil the shit out of that neighborhood, and that's going to prevent major crime. And that led to the rise of stop and frisk. It happens all over America, but New York City was probably one of the most infamous and widely publicized for it. Yes, exactly, under Giuliani. And so the idea that like, oh, this person looks suspicious and they're in a broken windows type neighborhood, I should stop them. Well, you know, as this has gone on, sex workers became one of the targets of that. And so something that happened a lot in particular was stopping trans women. I mean, cis women as well, but there was like an obscene number of trans women who were stopped. And police saying, oh, you have condoms on you, clearly you're a sex worker, and arresting someone and using the condoms as evidence. So there was no actual...
Oh my God, so sad.
Right. So there was no actual evidence that someone was a sex worker. Because like, if you go back and read police reports, it's like the most ridiculous bullshit. Like, they were wearing leather pants. She was wearing a low-cut top. Like, she had condoms. None of those things are like evidence of it. And even if they are a sex worker, like, I don't give a shit. But like, you know what I'm saying? Like, those are not evidence of sex work.
It's like almost the exact same thing they do with like to check for gang affiliation, right? It's like you're wearing this type of clothes, right? You were in this block, right? Like it's
Yeah, that's
I also see it as a kind of, this broken window theory is like, as far as like liberalism can go to identify crimes where it's going to look around and see crime, it's going to try and find explanations, but it's never going to understand a class analysis and a class struggle. So if it brings in loads of pigs in the block to repress people and repress the crime, they're never ever going to figure out that it's that repression that causes the crime.
Exactly.
Always.
Exactly.
No, I was going to say, I think the weirdest one I saw, I think I read a story on it, was like a certain pair of shoes. There was someone walking and the police stopped them and arrested them for being a member of X, Y, and Z gang because they had like a brand of shoe. And the police said, no, you don't understand, this brand of shoe is associated with this gang. And this dude was just walking down the street like, dude, these are just shoes. Like, I bought these and suddenly I'm a gang member because I bought...
Police,
busy as a fucking muppets.
Police do that all the fucking time, actually, which is super interesting because actually one of the things they do here is get gang injunctions. And so essentially what they do is like send police out with like surveys to people who have no idea what's going on. And they'll just be like, sign here if you want to reduce crime in your neighborhood. And then it's just putting people on gang injunctions. But then once you get, whether you're gang affiliated or not, and then once you actually get on a gang injunction, like you can like literally be like legally prohibited from going places. So like there's literally people who are on gang injunctions that have like kids and cannot take their kids to like certain parks or like amusement parks and stuff like that because they're on a gang injunction. And like it's just shit police made up. You know what I mean? And so and I really see like the current war on sex work sort of being like the new iteration of that. I think because in a lot of ways, like, I mean, obviously, like, there's still, like, all the racism and classism and all those things happening with police. But, you know, as the country, in America in particular, as it's gotten more, like, accepting of things like maybe marijuana shouldn't be a Schedule I drug and maybe you shouldn't be arrested for having marijuana, right? So as, like, those sort of attitudes are becoming more progressive, police and courts and, you know, law enforcement agencies still need a way to justify over-surveilling neighborhoods, and what they're really focusing now, in my opinion, is sex work, especially with this Nordic model shit, by reframing it to be like, well, we're not going to arrest you for doing sex work. And it's like, but are you still going to be in my neighborhood harassing me, my friends, my community, my peers? And the answer is yes. And like, nobody wants to talk about that part. And so I really see this as being like the new iteration of where that is going.
Yeah, definitely.
In a lot of ways. And so, yeah, but, you know.
No, it's true. And honestly, you say lump on a vanguard, but you're out there as well. You're at the forefront of everybody else as this is coming in. So this is why we've got to turn to you and look at these things going on, because if people are actively pushing out literally liberal legislation in support of people, if you don't mind me saying, you seem quite clever, you seem quite capable, you seem very progressive, you got good ideals, you got a good heart, you're saying all these things literally because you care. You're just talking shit, bullshit, and you obviously care about these things, and you care about these people, and you care about this goddamn suffering, the injustice all proletarians are going through. We know it, we get it. So let's just lead down into the next question. Like, have you ever personally encountered ostracization, alienation from other Marxist organizations or communities simply for your practice of sex trade, where ordinarily they wouldn't because of your politics?
Oh, absolutely, all the time, and that's fine. Because a lot of people really, like I said, a lot of people really do support the Nordic model because they don't understand what it looks like in practice. And I'm literally, looking at, places in Canada and the UK. And I'm also I should also say I'm coming from my own perspective of being Black in America specifically, which is a very unique thing. But I'm looking at the sex workers who are getting deported, out of Ireland right now, a lot of them are from Romania. I don't know necessarily how race works entirely in Europe, but both Irish people and Romanians are white in America. And so what I'm seeing is if white people are treating white people like this in Europe with this policy, it is going to be absolute fucking hell if it comes to America and white people get to use it on non-white people. And so that is terrifying to me in ways that I cannot even begin to adequately articulate, just based on racism and police brutality and things like that here.
If anything, if I know America as well as I know America, they'll implement it even worse.
Yes, they will. They absolutely will. And I'm so scared, honestly. And because the worst part is we do have a full decriminalization model in New Zealand, and trafficking went down. We actually have sex workers right now in New Zealand. There was a sex worker who worked in a brothel who was being sexually harassed by a manager and sued the brothel and won. That is workers' rights. That is the epitome of workers' rights. I was mistreated in my workplace and was able to take legal, to take a legal action and, be treated fairly despite being a sex worker. That is
a proletarian victory.
Yeah. And I mean, that is really the best one can expect under the system we have. And people are still no decriminalization. I'm but no, more of that. We should have more of that. Less of, I'm going to deport you because I caught you having sex for money. What? No.
I think it's also just that people don't understand the weaponization of policy, right? Even if 100% of the people who want the Nordic model have the best intentions at heart, right? And they're all, genuine, really good people and they actually want to solve the problem. You have to understand that when that policy gets enacted by the state, it's going to be weaponized, which means it will be used as a weapon to target certain communities more based on, the state's interests ultimately, right? There is no...
Absolutely.
Yeah. You have to look at how this is...
Of course, the race, I know Americans always talk about race. I know, but it's literally everywhere. It's everything here. But, because that's the thing is people think oh, we have to stop these traffickers and the Nordic model is going to keep women safe. But if you look at a lot of these trafficking trainings and things like that, being in an interracial couple with a non-white man and a white woman is one of the flags. A lot of these trainings. Shit like that. Or, other stuff this obsession with pimping. Because look at how they treated marijuana or drugs or these other sort of broken windows policies at the stop and frisk. Oh, I think you might be close to something. By default, if police can accuse you of being a sex worker, you're by default close to something illegal that's happening. Because again, purchasing services is still illegal. So it's perfectly acceptable under this model for police to just follow you. Right? And arrest your clients, but not just clients, also everyone around you, right? Because if they're following you around your neighborhood, oh, it looks like maybe that person has drug paraphernalia. Oh, that person has an expired tag on their car. Oh, this person is, whatever, just finding a reason to stop people. And that's really where I think it's going to go. And a lot of folks just have not grasped that yet. And that's really both frustrating and terrifying to me because they don't see how bad the implications can be. And I think that, looking at other countries where this has already been implemented should be giving us an indicator of where it's going to go. And folks still don't see it because they're still obsessed with I just want to protect women. And it's like, okay, but police aren't protecting me. I want them away from me. Please keep police away from me. They do not make me safe. They do not make my family safe. They do not make my household safe. They do not make my community safe. Police do not make me safe. I do not want police. I do not want state. I don't want the state involved in my life, in that aspect at all. And they just don't. They're still so focused on but we have to stop trafficking. And it's you're not really stopping trafficking by arresting people who've been trafficked and putting them in jail. That's not helping.
It actually adds on to a thought that I had yesterday. Basically, I'll give you my situation. So I was in a back garden. It was a middle class house. It was dead nice. It was out of the way. It was dead peaceful and bliss, and there was loads of space, and it was so organised, and you had all things in the back garden. It was beautiful, right? It was gorgeous with a fire going. But then, next door, they had these, kids running about that round with the phone, and, I was smoking weed, and then I was a bit paranoid because they were shouting shit, and I was like, are they shouting at me? I was like, what are they shouting? I didn't know if they were talking to each other or me, but then I thought, these pesky kids, and then, it made me think about how society views the lumpen in a way that's these middle class people are just literally living their own little world and their own reality that they've built up from time, and that's just them. They only interact with the world as much as they want, and often it's not much, so they literally have this small reality. So whenever they see kids going by in the neighbourhood with the hoods up and all of that, that's just a reminder that their world isn't the actual real world. There's other things going on. There's other things, and so that's why people are thrown into jail, into cages, is to keep this reality away from people. But to see this go on to Marxist circles and Marxist morality, that's a similar way where they don't want to look at the lumpen struggle, their revolutionary struggle, because they don't want to dirty themselves with the reality. That this is more than an intellectual exercise, and this is actually a material reality, and they need to stoop down to the lowest level if we're ever going to help each other up, and that's what we should be aiming for ultimately.
That's the reason why they think the state can help, though, right? Because if you're a white upper middle class person, the state actually does help you. If you phone the police, they actually will turn up and they actually will help you, right? So those people get it into their mind that wait, the state does good things, they're here to help us. So this sex work problem, why don't we just move the state in, move the police in, and they'll fix everything, right? They don't understand that their experience isn't universal.
That's what I'm getting at, and I think that even what's worse is if you are to make these arguments as a Marxist and these liberal takes that obviously policy is going to help our comrades, then, what more can I say? You're probably doing it, and you probably have a big following, and you probably have all of this and that, because there's a lot of liberals out there. It's easy to get a lot of following and supporters if they're all liberals. What we need is actual progressives, and our comrade is very progressive, and ideas very well thought out, educated, and just actually cool, and just literally is not hated on nobody, not tried to take away anybody's rights or take food out of anybody's mouth during this conversation on sex work.
Ultimately, I think that anyone who thinks that moving the state in will solve the problem, I think you're just sort of definitionally off the point there. I think it's a non-starter. I think if your starting position is we can solve this issue with legislation, then you're already wrong, right? It's a non-starter. You've failed before you even began.
Well, I was just going to say one thing real quick. I know I agree with that analysis, but I think a lot of the problem with that is actually media representation around sex work, because something we see a lot, law enforcement, local and state and federal law enforcement all got together and did this. Unfortunately, it's just not real. Stories where they're oh, this was a human rights thing, and then you look at her just and so, what people assume they do. So all they see is the headline and just run with that. And it's those headlines are not accurate. Like if you see a headline that says, 20 people arrested in sex trafficking sting, look at what they're actually charged with and how many of them are actually charged with trafficking. It's always like drug charges and prostitution charges, not human trafficking charges, not pimping charges. And a lot of people just don't know because they don't read past the headline.
It's probably also just laziness on their part as well, right? Like the police want, giant arrest numbers with the least amount of effort possible. So it's easier for them to just, arrest, regular sex workers and call them, human traffickers. It's easier to do that than it is to actually do the work to go after the real human traffickers, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think probably one of the most infamous cases recently was the Robert Kraft case. I don't know if you all followed that one at all.
No.
Because he owns he owns a football team in America. He owns, I think, the Patriots.
Oh, yeah.
So he owns a football team. Yeah. And
Miami,
so, like, the sting happened in Miami. The team he owns is in New England. But yeah. But that was a thing. They kept saying like it was a sex trafficking. Nobody was charged with human trafficking. Nobody was trafficked in that entire sting. And I don't feel like anybody knows that. Nobody who was involved with that was a victim of sex trafficking. All of the people who got arrested were consensual sex workers. And of course, like I said earlier, like about the living off the proceeds of prostitution, the people who got charges where the person who owned the spa where this was happening, they got charged with living off the proceeds of prostitution. They did not get charged with human trafficking or anything related to a sort of sex trafficking charge. But if you ask people, they'll say it was a sex trafficking charge, but nobody was trafficked. Absolutely nobody.
And it makes me think, well, why would that be presented in the news and the media? But again, you just turn back. The state wants to preserve itself, so it wants people to think that if they ever did abolish the police or abolish the state, then everybody's just going to get raped and murdered and trafficked. So we need the pigs there to defend us, and the pigs are doing boss stuff and like obviously we'll need to save them, but ultimately that's reactionary. I think the same people that would be against sex workers would probably be for keeping jails for that same reason, to propagate this idea that we can't just abolish a state and bring in, one by the people for the people. So, that's just liberalism for you.
Honestly.
Bureaucracies generally are self-licking ice cream cones, right? Like they exist to create problems to further, demonstrate their own existence, right? That's what they do. They create problems and then, oh, look, I need me to solve this problem. Give me more money, right? Like that's how this works. It reminds me of when, George Bush told Dick Cheney to go and find him the perfect vice president. Lo and behold, he come back and said, it's me. Like, yeah, of course he thought it was you. Like, no doubt. It's like the no-fly list in America, where they had a no-fly list and you could be put on it for like no reason at all, but there was no way to get off it. So if you were put on it for some unknown reason, there was just no way to get off it. And now obviously you can't fly, and that also shows up in like job searches when employers would do a background check on you. You're on a no-fly list. Now you're not getting that job for a reason that you don't know why. And you can't get off that list because there's no official like pathway to get off the list, right? It really is like a Kafka-esque trial type thing.
Absolutely.
Wow. So
yeah, that's a lot of how America works, and people still, even leftists, refuse to acknowledge how bad it is, and it's worrisome.
Yeah, thank you so much for everything so far. We're moving towards the end now. We'll just get into the nitty gritty. I've got to ask you a difficult question so that I appear unbiased and impartial.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, that Nordic model is very important, and you educated me. I did take quite a bit of notes for that, and I'll raise that during the next interview so we can cover both sides. Let's get into the nitty gritty. So, I think that obviously some of the main reasons that people would be against sex workers are because of the risks involved ultimately. Are there not very serious risks, dangers, and ideological trappings that come with prostitution? Could it not just be the case that your experience isn't universal with everybody, and therefore you should actually just accept that being pro-sex workers is neoliberalism?
Ironically, I don't think there are a lot of dangers in sex work. And ironically, the reason that I am so passionate about talking to this is because I have experienced them and I don't want other people to have to suffer the way that I did. So like I mentioned briefly earlier, I was dealing in my 20s with bouts of homelessness and doing street-based sex work. And I experienced a lot of violence, at the hands of so-called clients and definitely at the hands of police. And a lot of people I know because of the work I do, right? I mentioned I'm one of the executive directors of Swap USA. We get a lot of calls. One of our affiliate organizations is Swap Behind Bars. They run a hotline, and we have a lot of sex workers who routinely call in to talk about being abused, to talk about being raped, to talk about being robbed, to talk about being violently arrested, to talk about like some people want to blackmail sex workers. So I'm actually like really familiar with all the horrible things that sex workers go through. And my biggest thing is harm reduction. And the reason I'm so obsessed with talking about all this is because I do want harm reduction. I don't want other people to have to go through these things. And the Nordic model will not prevent that. Legalization will not prevent that. And criminalization is sure as shit not helping with that at all. So yeah, because I've been there, harm reduction is like my first and foremost priority. So yeah.
Yeah, so like nobody knows about the violence more than somebody who's actually suffered the violence, and that has led you to the logical conclusion that harm reduction is what you should strive for.
Yeah, absolutely.
As well as not accepting criminalization or flipping the Nordic model.
Yeah, absolutely, because we don't want people to have to suffer. We don't want people to be hurt, and we are very mindful of the communities that we serve, but unfortunately, a lot of the rhetoric that's anti-sex work is people saying, oh, well, you don't know how bad it is to be there. You don't get to talk about it. And it's like, no, I literally was there. I really do know how bad it is. And that's why I know the policies that you're laying out will not help. Because now you want a bunch of, because like my experiences are far from universal. Like there are so many sex workers I know, so many non-white sex workers, trans sex workers, street-based sex workers, drug-using sex workers. Like I know a lot. I know some sex workers who are, the sort of stereotype of like the white, like cis privileged young woman who's making all this money. Yeah, I know sex workers like that. I also know sex workers who are not like that at all. And I'm telling you, based on the lives we've lived, that continued police presence and shitty government policy is not helping our communities in any meaningful way. And in fact, it's usually hurting us. And so I'm not just saying that because I'm an anomaly. I'm saying that because that is the lived experience of so many sex workers. Police don't help. We don't want more police. Government policies, we're not even allowed in the room when the government makes policies around sex work. A lot of sex work policy requires conflating sex work and sex trafficking, even though those are very separate problems, and so it's like, I have lived through this. I work in this industry. Like this is, what I do. So I'm not coming from this perspective that like, I just know things because I'm special and I'm unique and I'm better than everyone else. I'm coming this, like I lived through some shit and all of my friends and colleagues have lived through some shit. And we don't want other people to have to live this way. So no, this isn't like a place of privilege or I'm unique or whatever. No, this is like, I do not want anybody to have to go through some of the shit I've been through and survived in my life. Because a lot of people went through the same things and didn't survive. And that's really fucking shitty.
I'm just going to throw another question at you, if you don't mind, because one of their counterpoints would be that they're not against sex workers. Of course not. That would be bad, They're just against the sex industry. Have you ever heard that? What do you think of that argument?
I mean, I don't know what that means. Like, I've heard that, but like, I don't know what that means. Like, how do you actively... Like, that sounds to me like when, like, conservative religious people be like, I don't hate gay people, but I think being gay is a sin.
Right.
Like, what the fuck does that mean?
Yeah, and they always say, like, hate the sinner, not the sin. And it's like, well, wait a minute.
Right. It's like, because it's, so, like, for starters, it's coming off the assumption that, like, it's bad to be a sex worker. Like, it's definitely something that's said as a moral judgment. Like, oh, I don't hate you, I just hate the industry. And it's like, but that is a moral judgment. So you already are coming in the conversation with negative attitudes around sex workers. But also, like, if you hate the industry and you don't hate sex workers, why don't you listen to sex workers who are telling you that these policies are hurting us? Taking down Backpage hurt sex workers. Sesta Fosta hurt sex workers. The Nordic model hurt sex workers. Having these religious organizations run these anti-trafficking programs hurts sex workers. These diversion programs hurt sex workers. Like, for someone who doesn't hate sex workers, these people are definitely not listening to anything sex workers say.
I'll tell you where this comes from, actually. It was actually from the Rev Left Discord when had people's reacting to that episode.
Really?
And then I commented something. I commented my take, and somebody said, "Terrible take, Shibby. Listen to the episode. They are very principled analysis of the trade and people who are in it." And then they said, like, under capitalism, workers treated like shit, blah, blah, blah. That's when they said, they're not against sex workers, they're against it as an industry. And they said that twice. They finished up on it as well. So, and then they said, like, don't be harassing dog parlour for these comrades. It's getting out of hand. Just listen to the episode, please. And I listened to it. You know what I'm saying? So, we're building on that. We're talking to each other from that. So I just thought I'd mention that. As if the comrade does listen to this, or people with that similar idea, then we can just address that ultimately.
Yeah, that's actually, like, hilarious to me that they're like, I don't hate sex workers, I just hate the industry.
So it reminds me of the Chinese, like, no, I'm not against Chinese people, I'm against, like, the CPC. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Because, like, because that's the thing. If you're trying to end the industry, there is not a way to end the industry that will not hurt sex workers. There is not a way, you know what I mean, to be anti-sex work industry without also being anti-sex workers.
That's what I was going to say. It's a symbiotic, right? It's a symbiotic relationship. Like, think about this in any other industry, right? Like, I'm not against people who make cars. I'm against the car industry. Well, hang on a minute. Without a car industry, you can't have people that work on cars. This makes no sense. You're making a distinction where one doesn't exist.
Politics of the anti-strikes again.
And I feel like that's part of that whole like obsession with the Nordic model, where they're like, but, you know, it's helping. And it's like, it's not actually helping that, because their thing is they want to see clients getting arrested because they think clients are, like, just horrible pieces of shit. And I mean, some of them are, but, you know, but it's like, I still need to eat. I still need to be able to pay my bills. So if you're legislating something that makes it more difficult or more dangerous for me to work, you're not actually pro-sex worker.
Yeah.
Like, it's just that simple.
I hope that you can continue to eat and continue to live in a happy life. God damn it. And I hope other people do that.
Thank you.
Stop being so horrible to each other. Come on, just fucking stand by each other. God damn it. Not trying to turn everybody into goddamn prostitutes. You know it's not what it is. You're just trying to be silly, take a moral high ground. Come on, we've got to be better than it. Let's just abolish capitalism.
I would love to abolish capitalism. Yes.
The question that I would have to ask them would be like, what does your idea succeeding look like, right? Like, if you get everything you want, if you succeed perfectly, like, what does the world look like if that happens? And if you're a carceral system and it's based on locking people up, then the end result of that is a ton of people in prison, right?
I mean, that's true, but they won't admit that because they're so hung up on, as a talking point, saying that the Nordic model doesn't arrest sex workers. But, like, as I mentioned before, like, it excludes all the other things that you can get in trouble for, right?
Yeah.
So, like, yeah, I might not get arrested, but I can be evicted. That's still a fucking problem for me.
Like you literally can't be a social creature. I mean, you're just alienated from everybody else through law. Otherwise you could potentially get them into trouble with the law. So
Exactly. And, like, they just refuse to acknowledge that happens under the Nordic model. And it's so bizarre. I think that one of the more bizarre things, just in general, talking about, like, sex worker rights, is how many people are, like, willing to speak over sex workers as if stuff doesn't happen. Like, as if there aren't, like, literally sex workers, like, tweeting from Sweden every time they get evicted for being a sex worker. Like, you can find these people. They're real people. And also, like, oh, you're being paid by the pimp lobby, which, whatever. You know, or like, oh, you're a fake account, or the pimp. No, it's not a thing. No, but a lot of people, because that's the thing, because people, like, the first thing they hear, in some ways, I might get pushback for this, but I'm going to say it anyway. In some ways, talking to people who, like, leftists specifically who are anti-sex work reminds me of talking to, like, the fucking pro-life crowd, where they're like anti-abortion, but they call themselves pro-life, but they're literally opposed to anything that makes people's lives better. And they're just really opposed to abortion, you know? They'll be like, I'm pro-life. And it's like, okay, how do you feel about living wages? No. How do you feel about universal health care? No. How do you feel about, you know what I mean?
Politics really is a hobby to so many people. It really is just an interest in middle class, like aristocratic hobby to some people, and what's worse is these people are the ones who are changing like political consciousness on the left in Marxist circles generally, and they're only doing it for a fucking hobby. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
A goddamn like academic venture, and seriously they're changing like the direction of like Marxist consensus, and we need to bring it back. We'll obviously regroup because we're all goddamn split up everywhere in just crazy skirmishes that for like battles that ended long ago, and we've got new battles.
I mean, yeah, I think a lot of it is like that, and it's just really frustrating that they're like, no, this is just about, you know, helping sex workers, and it's like, but you're not helping me. And then, you know, again, they'll be like, oh, well, because they're so like entrenched in these ideas, right? They're really obsessed with the idea that like almost all sex workers are trafficked, or they're there by force, or they, you know, have a pimp. And that's not true. But then when sex workers do like use their social media accounts to talk about things, I've been called part of the pimp lobby so many times. I've been called a fake account. People think I'm a white man. People think I'm a client who's like tweeting these things, because they're like, no, if you were a real sex worker, you wouldn't be allowed to tweet because your pimp wouldn't let you. And I'm like, I've never had a pimp in my life.
and you've never known a pimp or known a sex worker, so what are you talking about? Where do you get these ideas?
It really is the thing. And it's like so wild to me that people will honestly argue that. And interesting that people will say like, oh, but but you have to have a pimp. No, you don't. Like sex workers are talking all the time. They'll say, oh, if you have a sex worker, it's because you're privileged because you just do like webcam work. And it's like, no, I don't. And you know, I've done in-person work. I've had a Twitter account and done full service in-person work at the same time, you know, and like they really just refuse to grasp that. But that is a way to, you know, sort of discredit people. But it really is that obsession with the talking points, like all sex workers are trafficked, all sex is paid rape. And it's like, you don't get to like rewrite somebody's identity because you don't like what they're saying. You don't get to revoke their consent as a third party and say that, no, it was rape, even though you consented. Like, they're just fucking weirdos, and they're obsessed with controlling other people's bodily autonomy. Yeah. It's fucking weird.
Yeah, they're coming in trying to sloganeer your life and they've never even experienced it.
It's really fucking weird. I don't get it.
Yeah. It's also that, like, you know, they're trying to legislate out a problem that only exists in their mind, right? Because that situation doesn't exist on the ground.
Being pigs, though, it's like, but this is where, whenever we see progress, we're going to see repression, and it's the people policing ideas of the bourgeois ruling class, and that's what the people are doing when they're doing this. They're being reactionaries. That's what it comes down to. They're trying to defend progress. Whenever there's progress, these are going to come up and go, actually, I could get involved in this, and then, you know, suddenly if they've got a different opinion, they jump on board the goddamn liberal bandwagon in these synthetic left kind of fucking situations. People need to stop being fucking parasites in their own people and stop acting like pigs and fucking start turning on the pigs. I'm telling you, people get that, we're frustrated, and this is beyond a joke. If you don't, we are. I told you, know.
Yeah, I don't understand. I don't understand the obsession with policing other people's bodily autonomy like that. It's a little fucking weird. And then also, you know, I think the big thing with these folks who are like anti-sex work industry, but not anti-sex worker, is that they don't really have alternatives for sex workers. A lot of their stuff is very like theoretical, like, well, after the revolution, you won't have to do this. Okay, well, bring on that revolution, then I'm waiting. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, what do I do in the meantime? Like, what do sex workers do in the meantime? They need to eat. They need to be housed. And, you know, all this like theoretical shit about like, well, if we have a revolution, this and that. And it's like, we don't even have a living wage. Why? You know, I have chronic health conditions. I literally can't. I mean, you know, when I was younger, I could work as shit. I did. I used to, you know, waitress and work in factories and stuff, you know, when I was younger, in addition to doing sex work. And it's like, Now because of my health issues, I can't stand up for a 10-hour shift. So I could only work part-time, like physically, because that's what my body would allow. So why would I work part-time for less money to not be able to pay rent when I could just do sex work instead? And like, that's the thing, is they really do not address the material conditions. Like, they'll say like, oh, sex workers are forced into it because poverty. And it's like, well, so everybody under capitalism who's forced to work because being homeless is shitty. You know what I mean? Like, why do you hate, like, why aren't you trying to abolish fucking Starbucks? Like, do you know how much sexual harassment the baristas go through? Like, why are you know what I mean? So it's just weird that like sex work is the thing that folks have chosen to, sort of pick on because they're like morally opposed to it, but they're still not offering alternatives. And that's like a really big problem too, because if you want to tell me to quit my job, then you need to have something else that I can do immediately. And if you're not,
they'll go to a protest against sex workers, they'll go home and then they'll fucking masturbate to some porn. The fucking hypocrites.
They point with one hand and jack off with the other.
Oh shit.
Oh yeah.
Whoa.
Oh yeah. They do. They fucking do.
Yeah, that was fire. Yeah. Spitting bars.
Oh, I cannot take the credit for that one. That is just a sex worker saying. We have our own proverbs, and that is one of them.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. This is from a Patreon. We always like to give our patrons an opportunity to ask our guests a question themselves. It's just a big thank you for the support that they give towards the Serve the People program, which had recently started up, and just to show others that we're doing good work here, because money has social capital and social value, and people are consumers. So when they see that you've got loads of patrons, they're more likely to listen to you, and they need to listen to us. So we need to support each other. So unfortunately, that's what we have to do under capitalism. But this is from Nico Dengi. I've just got to warn you, I personally do not understand this question. I've wrapped my head around it, trying to understand it, and don't get it. Maybe it makes sense to you because it's probably American, but okay, so this is a question from Nico Dengi. How does the sex trade affect housing stability and vice versa? What should housing justice movements do to collectively make the right to exit a material reality?
I would definitely... No, that actually does make sense.
I do not get it.
I think what they're asking is, how can we ensure that sex workers are allowed to have housing? I'm assuming they're asking maybe from like a Nordic model perspective, in which case you would have to also make it illegal to basically make sex workers a protected class.
Yeah.
So that it would be illegal to deny rentals to them. You would also have to change like current laws around things like trafficking and pimping. And, as I said earlier, people get very like tense when you say that, because like, oh, you want kids to be raped? No. We do not want anybody to be trafficked. We don't want anybody to be assaulted. We don't want anything like that. But currently, if it is illegal to live off the proceeds of prostitution, that makes it very difficult to rent to sex workers. So we need to repeal laws like that and create more efficient laws to actually stop people who are traffickers, as opposed to punishing sex workers or punishing families of sex workers. So repealing those laws about that, making also doing I just forgot the word, sealing records. So if you have been arrested for a prostitution charge, sealing those records so landlords can't see it, and also so jobs can't see it. Those sort of things would go a lot further in making sure that sex workers can access housing. So the Nordic model does not account for that, and criminalization obviously doesn't account for that. So yeah, definitely keeping records sealed so landlords can't see, repealing updating, reforming the laws around living off the proceeds of prostitution, and creating a certain protection class for sex workers by saying that you can't discriminate on someone who has a history of sex work, when they apply to rent from you.
So yeah, those housing justice movements out there in the US, if you want to do something progressive for the sex working comrades, those seem to be some great suggestions. Thank you for the question and your support, Nico. Point of the episode is we just need solidarity and consensus if we're ever going to have a revolution towards socialism. I mean, none of us here have been bad towards other comrades. We've never told them what they should do. We've just merely advised what you yourself would recommend for sex workers in your situation. And as socialists, we should love and support you doing that. And we hope that that's what people get out of this. I'm looking forward to the next episode and to get these episodes out then, and then what we'll see is the reaction from people, and we'll see these ideas and these thoughts, these histories and experiences spread throughout the consciousness of the left, I'm sure, and those will, again, just like the Rev Left episode, bring out a lot more contradictions to the surface of what people are thinking and feeling in response to that. And we're going to continue to build this because we've got to keep talking to each other and keep building this love and solidarity between different classes, because ultimately the only politics we need is class analysis, dialectical materialism, scientific socialism. But to those comrades who just, it's not enough to learn and to listen to your thoughts and feelings, like, have you got any advice for what we can do or what we need to know to stop this reactionary, unprincipled behaviour from comrades on all sides, so we can have a people that are actually going to unite? Because I think at the core of Marxism, it's about uniting as a class. I think that that's been a long tradition in the Marxist circles. I don't think that's very controversial.
I think probably the biggest thing is actually listening to sex workers, which sounds like incredibly simple, but I mean, actually find some sex workers or some organizations who have social media accounts and actually follow them to see what they're talking about. Because I can't speak for everyone who has, Marxist tendencies, who doesn't like sex workers, but I really do feel like a lot of folks who do have those sort of tendencies are just really coming from a place of being uninformed a lot of the time, because they hear sex trafficking or they hear, sex workers all have pimps or something like that. And so they don't know what to do. And that's not really like the reality of the situation. And so actually sitting down and watching sex workers talk about their lives, because sex workers do on social media, and what helps and what doesn't help, I think is hugely instrumental. Because a lot of people that I still talk to now, one of their turning points was following, I think it's called Rose Alliance. They're in Sweden. So under the Swedish model was how they had to do a fundraiser and scramble to find housing for someone who got evicted because they were a sex worker. Because these people really did have this attitude that the Nordic model's safe and it's going to help everybody, and then all of a sudden they're seeing this, or folks who say, legalization is a great model, it's going to help everybody. And then all these horror stories come out from sex workers who are working under legalized models, especially in Nevada. The restrictions that the workers are under there are just fucking ridiculous, to be honest. And, that sort of thing. And so really listen to what folks are saying, because they do have the lived experience and they have the ability to know what is best for them. And it's usually not continued police state. It's not state surveillance. Those things are not helpful at all. They don't create a sense of safety. They don't create a sense of community. And so, but you don't know that, or you don't know how these things are being implemented if you've never actually talked to sex workers, because the news media is not going to cover it. Unfortunately, even leftist news media isn't going to accurately cover it. So it is really important to do your own research and seek out sex workers and understand what's going on. And, really do challenge some of these narratives. If somebody says that the Nordic model's good because you won't be arrested. Well, what happens if you get evicted? What happens if your kids get taken from you because you're still doing something that's, quote unquote bad? What happens if your partner gets arrested or your roommate gets arrested because you're technically brothel keeping by working together? What about all these other situations that sex workers know about because they have to live through these situations that maybe didn't occur to you? So it's just really important to really build those bridges and really sit down and listen to the concerns that people have, not just basic concerns that we all have under capitalism, right? Like poverty, or I can't access my health insurance, or, my rent is going up, those sort of things, obviously important. But when it comes to sex work, specifically talk to sex workers about how policies are impacting them. Because the stuff, like I mentioned, like getting arrested for having condoms, people don't know that. Getting arrested for being a suspected trafficking victim, people don't know that. The way the media reframes things and says that, there's these trafficking stings and then no traffickers are found anywhere because nobody was actually trafficked. People don't know that. And I understand how and why people don't know that. But at some point, you do have to do your own independent research and talk to the people who are living in that and like develop your own ideas around that. I feel like that was a really long answer. I'm sorry.
Oh, very well said, sister. Great points there. And obviously these are points that, as we know, have not hit the goddamn eardrums of human beings since now, because nobody talks about this shit predominantly in the left, and we want to just keep raising this consciousness because, I mean, it's essential. It's not as fancy as a bit of Marx and Engels, but, you know, with people living today, it's what we're going through here. So, yeah, important. Do go and follow other sex workers on social media. You do get to see their amazing supportive communities because they do have nobody else but themselves. In these hard times, it literally is nobody else but themselves. It seems to be not even most Marxists, the ones that do it, very amazing principled comrades, love and solidarity forever. To you, beautiful people, but to everybody else, all the other liberals, you know, we leaving sex workers with nowhere else to go but trouble, disabled, mental health problems, could have addictions, could have all these things that you think that they are, but you're literally just leaving them with in dire situations when they're trying to improve it, and not even, whilst obviously, as we've heard, trying to actively make it worse. So follow sex workers on social media, see what they're actually talking about. And that's a lot better than just watching shit posts on Twitter against sex workers, you know, like real shit.
Yes. Right, yeah, please listen to sex workers and not the shit posts, please. Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah.
Okay, so, but it really does go a long way, you know, if people do occasionally retweet, you know, a base tweet from a sex working comrade on some sick analysis or news or something, that really does push the stigma back, and that's what we're fighting here, social stigma. So do support the comrades, definitely. Have you got any final thoughts, Phoenix, before we get to your plugs?
I think I covered pretty much everything I wanted to cover. Unintended consequences of the Nordic model and legalization. Letting a sex worker is broken window. Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to roll it all back in my head.
You covered it all and you've done it excellently as well.
Thank you. I think we got it.
Yeah, cool. Okay, then. So where can people find you, where they can support you and your work? And is there anything else that you want people to find in the show notes, which will include?
Well, you can always find me on Twitter. My Twitter is @UppityNegress with 2 P's, 2 T's, and 2 S's. I also work for Swap USA. You can always, we have our website, we have our social media. The other thing I would recommend is just really following other sex worker organizations. Lysistrata comes to mind. SWAI is an Irish organization. Sweat Tweets, SWEAT, that is a South African collective of sex workers that tweets about sex work. So yeah, there's actually a lot of organizations. Hacking Hustling is one. They focus on digital safety with sex workers. So there's actually like a lot of organizations that are pro-sex worker or are friendly to sex workers who are doing a lot of work in a lot of ways around like local organizing, around doing mutual aid, around actual like lobbying and policy. Swap Behind Bars is amazing. They help sex workers who have been incarcerated like sort of get back on their feet and help them reintegrate into society. So like that work is super, super important. I love Alexandra so much. She's so amazing. But like there's so many people doing so much amazing work right now. And I think that is important, just one, because it speaks to the resilience of the sex work community, especially after coming off COVID, because sex workers were excluded from almost every COVID sort of like relief package. Wow. And so all the mutual aid was just sex workers among each other. So that was like really beautiful to see. But, just follow these sort of orgs and these sort of folks, because this is how you will actually know, because it's one thing to hear someone say that, oh, the Nordic model is good, it'll help sex workers. But when you see actual sex workers being like, I lived under this model, it is not helping me, or this is how this model would impact me, I think that's really the place to go. So National Ugly Mugs, Sex Work Hive, Mistress Blunt, Red Canary Song, they are an American org that works specifically with Asian sex workers, particularly like migrant Asian American sex workers. Maya Morena is a sex worker who talks a lot about immigration status. She's undocumented and working. Yeah, there's just so many. There's just so many folks, but follow everybody.
I was just going to say, like, I love the internationalism also, right? Like, I love the understanding that, the struggle doesn't respect borders.
Yeah, I mean, I want to say, UK sex working comrades, I'm sorry I have never platformed any of you that don't know where to start. Seriously, it just always seems to be US comrades who are pushing for progressive justice, who seem to have stumbled across us. We'll get to the UK someday.
Yeah, I do also appreciate the global aspect. India, which I think may surprise people maybe just because there's like sort of perceptions around sex work in India and sex trafficking from a Western perspective. But sex workers in India are actually some of the most well-organized activists when it comes to sex worker rights. Like the shit they have managed to pull off is fucking amazing. And very rarely repeated or reported in Western media for obvious reasons. But so much of the work that is happening, all over the world. I was actually just on a call and we had people from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, UK, Ireland, France. It's just, so many folks are really working on these issues and really coming together. And it's really a beautiful show of solidarity.
And that just shows the point that it's a worldwide problem because, capitalism, class structure, society is across the whole goddamn globe. It's not just to do with certain policy or criminology. It's literally a direct planned effect from economic policy that's coming to affect things politically and socially. It's that basic.
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been fun as well. It's been interesting. I've learned a lot. I'm going to listen back to it as well before the next interview to let it all sink in.
I'm sorry this took so long. I just kind of kept rambling. My bad.
No, it's good.
It's
that important. Like I said, there's a lot of listeners who are going to be highly anticipating this, as well as the one with Esperanza. I'll tell you now as well, for the artwork, what I'm going to have is like the yin-yang, yeah? Except I'm going to have half of it, and like your face is going to be on one of the circles, and Esperanza's face is going to be in the other circle, while the other half of it is our logo. So that's going to show like the dialectics of this. I just hope that people will go over and follow you, give you some support, and give you some feedback to just tell you really how useful and how progressive that was, because you need some solidarity from that, because that was some fucking boss work, and I know that you're gonna have given a lot of people solidarity from that, especially like the comrades that we know that they're really gonna be so grateful for this. So thank you again, and I really hope that you have a good night.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Workers and lumpen of the world, unite.
She is a belter, different from the rest. Diamonds on her finger and she always looks her best. She is a gangster with 100 mile stare. When she walks, her feet don't touch a floor. She is a belter. She plays with lightning, have 100 miles high, dishing out the thunder like a god inside the sky. She is a dancer, and she dances in my dreams. Reminds me that the world is not as evil as it seems. She is a belter. No happy endings, unless fairy tales come true. But she looks like a princess and there's not much else to do. I think I love her. She gets underneath my skin, but I've been stung a few times, so I don't let no one I know even belt her. She is a belter. She is a belter. She is a belter. How can she reach me when I'm high above the shelf? Lost inside a smoke ring while I ponder to myself, is she the answer to the question in my mind? Is happiness an option, or is love just turned me blind? Is she a belter? No happy endings unless fairy tales come true, but she looks like a princess and there's not much else to do. I think I love her. She gets underneath my skin, but I've been stung a few times, so I don't want no one and no even belter. She is a belter. She is a belter. She is a belter.